It's late summer 1566. 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, veterans of dozens of campaigns, are marching straight toward a tiny Hungarian fortress most people couldn't even find on a map. Behind them stands the most feared war machine in the world. Cannons, janissaries, sipahi cavalry, an empire that has swallowed cities, kingdoms, and entire cultures whole. And in front of them, about 2,500 Hungarians, a handful of knights, some farmers, a few old soldiers who'd fought in wars everyone else had forgotten, all packed inside a fortress no bigger than a modest town square. On paper, this should have been over in a single afternoon. The Ottomans had the numbers, the guns, the resources, everything. But what happened over the next month didn't just shock the Sultan. It forced the greatest empire of the age to bleed for every inch of ground, and it turned a tiny patch of earth called Szigetvár into one of the most heroic stands in European history. Most people today remember the final explosion, the last charge, the fall of the fortress. But the real story, the one that explains how 2,500 men stopped an army 20 times their size, starts much earlier inside the walls, inside the minds of the men who refused to run. Welcome to Heroic History, where we dive into the battles that should have been impossible but weren't. If you love strategy, courage, and stories that still echo centuries later, hit subscribe and join our growing community of history lovers. So let's ask, how did a tiny garrison stall the greatest army in the world? What turned Szigetvár into the graveyard of Ottoman momentum? And why does this little fortress still matter today? Let's find out. In 1566, the siege of Szigetvár unfolded against the backdrop of the brutal Ottoman-Habsburg War, which had been raging since 1565. The Habsburgs, controlling parts of Hungary and Austria, are trying to hold on to what's left of the kingdom after a disastrous battle 40 years earlier, the Battle of Mohács in 1526. That battle shattered the Hungarian army, and Hungary itself was divided. Some lands fell under Ottoman influence, some under Habsburg rule. The tension never really went away. Even temporary peace treaties couldn't hide the fact that both empires were eyeing the same strategic spots, especially Transylvania, which the Ottomans saw as theirs. For the Ottoman Empire, Hungary was the gateway to Central Europe. And for Sultan Süleyman I, known to history as the Magnificent, Hungary represented a final barrier standing between him and Vienna, the jewel of the Habsburgs. But the story wasn't just about politics or territorial conquest. Süleyman himself was 72 years old, traveling with a body weakened by years of campaigns and illness. Imagine commanding tens of thousands of troops while your own health is failing. That kind of pressure fell squarely on the shoulders of his Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha. The stakes were enormous. Every day counted, and a swift, decisive victory wasn't just desirable, it was essential. It would justify the cost, the risk, and the human lives invested in the campaign, while also keeping the sprawling Ottoman administrative system stable. So Süleyman marshaled a massive force, somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 soldiers, accompanied by 300 cannons. These numbers seem overwhelming, but the Ottoman army faced massive logistical challenges, feeding tens of thousands of men, moving heavy artillery, and maintaining morale in hostile territory. And when the siege dragged on, casualties mounted, supplies ran thin, and the army's momentum towards Central Europe slowed. What was supposed to be a quick, decisive campaign suddenly turned into a grinding test of endurance. Now, let's talk about Szigetvár itself. Located roughly 30 kilometers west of Pécs, a fortress town sitting on lowlands surrounded by marshy terrain with moats and channels cutting through the landscape. It was a choke point, a strategic barrier that could not be ignored. Why? Because it sat on a route Süleyman could take straight to Vienna. What made Szigetvár truly formidable was its design. It was a fortress built in layers. You had the old town, then the new town, and finally the inner citadel at the heart. Around all this, they created an artificial moat and extensive marshes, turning the landscape itself into a defensive weapon. For the Ottomans, this meant one crucial thing. They couldn't just throw their massive force at the fortress and expect it to fall. Each section had to be captured individually, a painstaking process that nullified much of their advantage in numbers and artillery. The fortress, enhanced by the natural terrain, became a bottleneck, a deadly pinch point, where Ottoman numbers couldn't easily overwhelm the defenders. It was a masterclass in defense in depth long before the term was officially coined. At the center of this drama was Nicola IV Szubich-Zrinski, or Miklos Zrinyi, as he's often called, the commander of the Hungarian-Croatian garrison. He led roughly 2,300 to 3,000 men, a fraction of the Ottoman army, but men who were fiercely loyal and battle-hardened. Zrinski's decision to hold the fortress was a political statement. He and his troops understood that their stand would symbolize resistance to Ottoman expansion into Europe. Even facing near-certain death, they were determined to fight, knowing their defiance would resonate far beyond the walls of Szigetvár. So, how did a small garrison hold off a massive empire? The answer lies in both engineering and terrain. Szigetvár's fortress was a layered defensive marvel, with the old town, new town, and an inner citadel all surrounded by marshes and artificial moats. For the Ottoman army, this meant no easy frontal assault. Infantry and artillery couldn't simply march up to the walls. They had to fight for every inch of land, slogging through wetlands and under constant fire. This is where Ottoman ingenuity came into play, but at a human cost. Their engineers built massive ramps and embankments, essentially man-made highways across the swamp, allowing artillery and infantry to approach the walls. Think about it. Hundreds of soldiers laboring under constant enemy fire, shoveling dirt and constructing ramps large enough to move cannons. The technical skill was extraordinary, but so was the bloodshed. These engineering efforts allowed the Ottomans to finally bring their artillery to bear, but only after weeks of grueling work under extreme danger. And even then, the cannons weren't the game-changer Suleiman might have hoped for. The combination of strong walls and flooded terrain limited the effectiveness of their 300 cannons. That meant Ottoman infantry had to continue engaging in frontal assaults while engineers kept building. Every attack, every skirmish, every counter from Zrinski's men slowed the army's advance and inflicted heavy losses. The defenders were outnumbered somewhere between 25 to 50 times. Despite that, the siege lasted 34 days from August 6th to September 8th, 1566. And the casualties? They were staggering. Almost the entire garrison was lost, 2,300 to 3,000 men. But the Ottomans weren't unscathed either. They suffered an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 casualties. That's unusually high for a siege, showing just how effective a small determined force can be when the terrain and fortifications favor them. Let's walk through how those 34 days unfolded stage by stage, because Szigetvár's defenses were built like a three-layered trap. The siege opened with the Ottomans clearing obstacles and smashing the outer defenses, the old town. Think of this first layer as a shield around the real fortress. The defenders fought hard, forcing the Ottomans to pour in heavy artillery fire just to secure the outskirts. After almost 2 weeks of non-stop pressure, the old town finally fell. But Zrinski didn't panic. He pulled his men back, orderly, organized, almost calm, and reinforced the new town, the second defensive ring. This was where the real battle would begin. And the Ottomans had no idea how complicated the next step would be. This was the brutal heart of the siege. The new town sat behind marshes and water defenses, which meant Ottoman soldiers couldn't just march in. They needed solid ground, and to create that, their engineers began building huge earthen ramps and raised causeways, massive structures of dirt and timber designed to bridge the swamp. Imagine hundreds of men shoveling dirt under constant gunfire day after day. Every time the Ottomans built a ramp, Zrinski's men would rush out, launch a surprise attack, set the works on fire, and retreat before being overwhelmed. These sorties didn't just slow the Ottomans, they caused horrific casualties among the sappers and the infantry protecting them. And despite all this effort, the terrain still blunted the Ottoman firepower. They had roughly 300 cannons, but most of them couldn't get close enough to the walls. And when they did, the wet conditions weakened the ground beneath them. Shots landed, but the damage wasn't decisive. Still, through sheer numbers, the Ottomans eventually pushed through. By September 2nd, the new town fell, but the price was devastating. The enemy army was exhausted, and thousands were dead or wounded. The defenders, meanwhile, had been whittled down to roughly 600 fighting men. Now everything came down to the inner citadel, the smallest but strongest part of the fortress. By this point, Szigetvár was half ruins, half smoldering battlefield. The defenders had almost no food, almost no men, and almost no hope of relief. And yet, they held on. But something else was happening behind the scenes, something the defenders couldn't see. On or around September 6th, Sultan Süleyman died in his command tent. His death was a political earthquake. If the army learned their emperor was gone, panic could spread, or worse. Successors back in Constantinople might start fighting for the throne before the army returned with a victory. So the Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, did the only thing he could. He hid the Sultan's death. He kept it secret from almost the entire army, and he needed the siege to end fast before rumors slipped out. That urgency fueled what would become the final crushing assault on the inner citadel. By the morning of September 8th, the fortress was basically a burning skeleton. Walls were shattered, smoke poured from the ruins, and the courtyard was littered with debris. The Ottomans were tightening the noose, preparing a final push. Zrinski knew the end was moments away. Rather than die trapped inside the rubble, he gathered his remaining 600 men, though some accounts suggest fewer, and prepared for one final sortie. Picture the scene: armor dented and blackened by smoke, clothes soaked with days of rain and sweat, faces streaked with ash. These were men who had been fighting almost non-stop for a month. And yet they opened the gates and charged straight into an army, tens of thousands strong. It was an act of pure defiance. The janissaries quickly surrounded them. Zrinski fought his way across the inner bridge, but he was struck down by gunfire. Minutes later, the last pockets of defenders were overwhelmed. Almost every defender was dead. But the Ottomans didn't get to savor their victory. Not really, because now Sokollu had to race back and secure the succession before news of Süleyman's death spread. The siege had achieved its tactical goal, but had drained the army and derailed the campaign. Vienna would not be attacked that year, or the next, or ever again by Süleyman's hand. However, it's almost strange how the legend outgrew the actual military reality. What happened on the ground was, in pure military terms, a desperate last raid, a final breakout that didn't succeed and had no real chance of succeeding. But the way people remembered it, that's a whole different story. Within just a few years, the actions of Miklos Zrinyi were being retold like something out of an epic poem. And honestly, that's exactly what happened. Hungarian and Croatian poets turned his final charge into a national saga. Instead of a doomed last stand, it became a symbol, a man choosing certain death rather than bowing to an empire of almost 1 million square miles. Zrinyi became the face of sacrifice, the living portrait of resistance when the odds were so bad that most people wouldn't have even stayed to watch. It got to the point where his death wasn't just military history anymore. It became cultural memory, a kind of anchor. People looked at Szigetvár and saw identity, not strategy. But here's where things take an unexpected turn. A political twist so strange that it almost overshadows the battle itself. The single most important event of the entire siege happened quietly in a tent. Sultan Süleyman I, the same Süleyman who expanded the empire to 3 continents, the ruler whose armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, died right there at Szigetvár. Most historians place it around September 6, 1566. And here's the unsettling part. He died 2 days before the fortress fell. His internal organs were removed and buried right where the tent stood, right on that patch of ground. Later on, his son Selim II ordered a türbe, an Ottoman mausoleum, to be built over it. But then the location got lost to time, completely lost. For centuries, people searched for it like some kind of imperial ghost. And only recently have Hungarian researchers, folks like Dr. Norbert Papp, started narrowing down the area. Again, it matters, because it's the only missing tomb of the entire Ottoman imperial line. One missing puzzle piece from a dynasty that kept records on almost everything. But the real shock is what happened after he died. Here's the situation. The Sultan dies instantly, far from home, surrounded by tens of thousands of soldiers, including the janissaries. The same janissaries who had a long history of reacting, let's say, aggressively to political instability. A death like this could have caused chaos, looting, mutiny, factions forming overnight. The army could have ripped itself apart before it even left Hungary. But that didn't happen. Why? Because Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the Grand Vizier, made one of the boldest political plays in Ottoman history. He hid the Sultan's death. Not for a day, not for a week, for 48 days. 48 days of running the empire in total secrecy. 48 days of issuing orders in the Sultan's name. 48 days of pretending nothing had happened while everyone waited for Selim II, the heir, to reach Constantinople and secure the throne. And in that time, Sokollu kept the army together. He kept the janissaries calm. He made sure Szigetvár was taken so the campaign still looked like a victory. He blocked anyone from bolting to the new sultan to claim rewards. He basically kept a giant war machine from exploding while its engine was already gone. It was such a clean political operation that it's hard not to see it as one of the greatest acts of administrative crisis management in Ottoman history. In that moment, Sokollu wasn't just a vizier. He was the glue holding the empire together. Instead, the Ottomans stabilized. They shifted from aggressive expansion to administration, consolidation, and holding what they had. Szigetvár became the hinge moment, the place where a military disaster could have turned into a political catastrophe, but instead became the start of a more controlled bureaucratic era. On paper, the Ottomans won. They took Szigetvár, but the numbers tell a much different story. Most estimates place Ottoman losses somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 men, an enormous number for a single siege. To put that into perspective, that's the size of a mid-sized medieval kingdom's entire field army. And on top of that, they lost the greatest sultan in their history. That's the kind of victory where you walk away wondering if winning was worth it at all. The original goal of the campaign was Vienna. Vienna was the big prize, the western anchor of Habsburg power. But after Szigetvár, the Ottomans simply couldn't push any farther. The army was exhausted. The command structure was shaken. The strategic balance had shifted. Vienna wasn't just postponed, it was taken off the table. In a very real sense, Szigetvár slammed a door shut. It marked the point where full-scale deep penetration offensives into Central Europe were no longer feasible at an acceptable cost, and Ottoman leaders noticed that. They had to, because the numbers didn't lie. 2 years later, when everyone had had time to count the casualties, bury the dead, and see what kind of ruler Selim II was, the Ottomans and the Habsburgs signed the 1568 Treaty of Adrianople. The treaty basically froze the frontier. It created a stable, let's not do this again anytime soon balance between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, and that stability grew directly out of the shock of Szigetvár. From that point forward, under Selim II and under Sokollu's guidance, Ottoman strategy shifted. Instead of dreaming about marching to Vienna or pushing deeper into Central Europe, they started focusing on what they already had. They consolidated provinces like the Eyalet of Buda. They rebuilt, reorganized and re-administrated, and they redirected their attention to a different threat, the Mediterranean. And while the army had been bloodied and exhausted by Szigetvár, the navy still had energy. The Ottoman fleet operating in the Mediterranean became the next focus. Suddenly, naval supremacy wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a strategic necessity. By the 1570s, this shift led to massive naval confrontations, the most famous of which was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. It was a colossal clash. Galleys ramming, cannons firing, tens of thousands of men fighting on the waves that would echo in European and Ottoman memory for generations. The irony is striking. A fortress in Hungary, thousands of miles from the Mediterranean, indirectly influenced the course of naval warfare in Europe. Szigetvár didn't just kill an emperor, it rewrote the empire's strategic priorities. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha understood something crucial that not every Ottoman leader did. Sometimes the empire's biggest enemy wasn't the army across the border, but instability at home. He realized that wars could be fought endlessly, but an empire that could not govern itself efficiently was doomed, no matter how large its armies or how skilled its generals. So during his 15-year tenure as Grand Vizier, Sokollu focused less on expansion and more on strengthening the internal framework of the empire. He overhauled tax collection, ensured that governors were accountable, maintained unity among the diverse provinces, and reinforced the bureaucracy. He prioritized stability, efficiency, and the long-term sustainability of the state, recognizing that these internal measures could multiply military effectiveness more reliably than any single battlefield victory. In essence, Szigetvár forced the Ottoman Empire to confront a hard truth. Conquest alone was not enough. To endure, to remain a true superpower of the 16th century, the empire needed smart administration, disciplined governance, and strategic flexibility. And Sokollu, through his vision and careful management, ensured that the empire adapted and survived long after the smoke cleared over the walls of Szigetvár. Sokollu was brilliant, no question about it. He could read a crisis like most people read a book, anticipating every ripple before it even appeared. He was also completely irreplaceable. Everything the empire relied on, from keeping the army in line to managing political rivals and coordinating the far-flung provinces, depended on him personally. He never built a system that could function smoothly without his presence and his judgment. There were no manuals, no permanent structures robust enough to survive his absence. In short, the empire's stability rested on a single man's shoulders, and the cracks in that system were already visible back at Szigetvár. The very fact that the Sultan's death had to be hidden for nearly 2 months shows just how delicate the Ottoman leadership structure had become. Imagine it. Tens of thousands of soldiers stationed hundreds of miles from Constantinople, their loyalty contingent on who was in charge. One wrong rumor, one misstep, and the entire army could have fractured. Sokollu's ability to maintain control under such conditions was nothing short of extraordinary, but it was also a glaring warning sign. The empire's survival wasn't guaranteed. It depended on the brilliance and discretion of a single individual. Fast forward to 1579 when Sokollu was assassinated. Suddenly, all those cracks that had been quietly patched under his leadership widened into open gaps. The next Sultan, Murad III, inherited an empire where the mechanisms of governance were far from self-sustaining. In his 16-year reign, Murad went through 10 grand viziers, an almost unbelievable turnover rate. That level of instability isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's a red flag for any administration. It meant that power, policy, and strategic direction were constantly in flux. Decisions that should have been coordinated over decades instead became fragmented and reactive. The empire could survive, but it had lost the certainty and cohesion that a strong system provides. And this brings us full circle back to Szigetvár. That siege, that small fortress in Hungary, was far more than a brutal military engagement. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of Ottoman power. Not just on the battlefield, where even a small garrison could bleed an army of 100,000 men, but off the battlefield in the delicate balance of politics, administration, and succession. Sokollu's genius kept the system intact, held the empire together during its most vulnerable moment. But brilliance alone isn't a sustainable structure. Szigetvár didn't fix the system. It just bought the empire time. It delayed the reckoning. It postponed the chaos. But eventually the empire would have to confront the fact that stability built on one man's skill is always precarious. In other words, Szigetvár was both a triumph and a warning. It was a battlefield lesson that power, even when absolute, has limits, and that even empires, vast and formidable, are fragile when their systems aren't designed to endure beyond the genius of a single individual. Sokollu may have held the Ottoman world together for decades, but Szigetvár reminds us that no one man can permanently hold back the tide of history. Thanks for sticking with me through the siege of Szigetvár. If this story of courage, strategy, and political maneuvering blew your mind, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share it with someone who loves epic history and don't go far. There are more impossible battles, heroic stands, and moments where strategy and human will collide coming up that you won't want to miss.